Okay.
Yeah.
Shall we? Yeah. Oh, wait, am I going to kick us off? Oh,
Do you think?
sure. Okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Hansen. I lead the business models for local news research at the Shorenstein Center at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. Okay, thank you. I'll speak louder. We are really excited to be here with you. We're hoping to kind of wake everybody up with this presentation. We know we're about halfway through. Some of you look like you didn't get much sleep last night, so we're going to try to throw some provocative questions into the audience. But before we do that, I'll let my fellow panelists here introduce themselves.
My name's Damian Tambini, and I work at the London School of Economics.
Martin Moore from King's College London, where I run a centre called the Centre for the Study of Media, Communication and Power.
Go ahead.
So, would you like us to start? I mean, we're here presenting a book which is almost a year old, but we're also working on the next version of that book. And the book's about the tech giants, what they do for us, what they should do for us, and are they too big? But I've thought long and hard about what I'm going to say to this conference in particular, because I believe there might be some journalists in the room. Are there any journalists here? And I thought when I decided that I might say this, that it might be really very controversial. And I wasn't sure whether this conference is ready to hear what I have to say. I think you might start throwing stuff. We might not be completely safe. So I'm really hoping that you're going to really start to hopefully think about these things and not take any kind of direct physical action. What I want to say really is that this conference and journalism and news and the people in this room who think about tech, power, and the really long-term societal debates should be taking a different approach. What I have to say is that we've got to stop talking about saving journalism. And to drive the point home even further, I'd like to say that the world does not need journalism. So, what do I mean by that? And I'm going to make it worse now by using a really loaded metaphor. The metaphor is, say, the oil industry. Now, the oil industry could say, the world needs the oil industry. But we don't need the oil industry, do we? No, we need energy. So for journalism will say the world needs journalism. But in the long term, as we negotiate the big technological changes we're going through, we need to understand that we don't need journalism any more than we need the oil industry. We need deliberation. We need spaces for debate. We need filters of truth. And we need trust in information. Those things can be provided by journalism. Of course, they're currently provided by journalism. But in the long term, the question of whether it's journalism as we know it that delivers these kinds of things is a secondary question. So where am I going with all of this? I think it's time the world of journalism gets out of its defensive crouch and its zero-sum attacks on the platforms. I think we need to have a more generative, long-term debate about the kind of information systems democracy needs. Democracies, you may have noticed, have their backs against the wall. This is a very difficult period for liberal democracy, And part of the reason we're here, and also part of the solution, has a lot to do with what we call in the book digital dominance. So I want journalists and the news to engage with that debate. So this brings me to the book itself. What do we do in this book? We're trying to feed into that debate. Martin and I tried to bring together some of the world's leading experts on some of these interlocking problems and think about what the model that we have means for society. And the model that we have is that because of the regulatory settlement that was set out more than 20 years ago, we've enabled and allowed in the stack of internet services between physical layer, which is quite tightly regulated for competition, and the content layer, which is also quite tightly regulated for competition, we have these platform services. They've been allowed to become dominant. They are subject to particular economic factors, which mean that there are winner-takes-all or winner-takes-most characteristics. There are high switching costs. There are difficulties in having normal conditions of competition in these platform services. And increasingly, we're realizing that they're not good for society. And linked to the power and dominance of these platforms and the negative effects they have is a real difficulty in reaching a regulatory solution for these platforms. That debate is now happening, thanks in part to a partly self-interested debate which is driven by journalism. We have dragged Zuckerberg and co. to the table. But now, with that approach of trying to save journalism, but now I think it's more than a debate about saving news organizations. It's more than a debate about the place of professional journalism within that ecology. It's a real debate about whether we need a different kind of system. And in particular, a debate about two scenarios, and I'll set them out before I finish. One is a scenario in which we have one big social media company which is regulated as a monopoly. I would argue that with Zuckerberg's latest intervention, that is what he wants. He wants a regulatory settlement that will raise the barriers to entry, that will create a lot of costs for providers of social media services, so that only Facebook, and possibly YouTube as well, can afford to meet the regulatory requirements. But there is another solution, and it's one that I think we should be thinking about. That's a solution in which we have a plurality of different providers of social media services, Facebooks, Legbooks, Armbooks, Backbooks, all kinds of different social media platforms. Some of those might even be provided by the public or funded in different ways. Some of them might be subsidized, some of them might be international, some of them might be local. And consumers should have the ability to switch between them so that competition can act as a constraint on the operators of those platforms. So that goes a little bit beyond what we said in the book, but I think it's incumbent on us all to really think about having a debate which is less about the interests of one sector, for example, journalism, and more about democracy. Thank you.
Okay. I don't know if this is good cop, bad cop, or bad cop, bad cop. I also wanted us to take the conversation here slightly outside of this room and outside of this wonderful bubble that we have here in Perugia, in the sense that, I think we need to keep asking ourselves, why is dominance a problem? Why should we be worried about digital dominance? There's an assumption, and I've certainly made it myself, and I think that certainly from many of the conversations I've heard here already, it's a slightly complacent assumption, I think, that digital dominance is a bad thing, that we have to deal with digital dominance, that we have to get beyond digital dominance. And as Damian says, that a part of that is because we don't think it's good for journalism. But I think again, thinking of it from a broader perspective, and particularly thinking about it from the perspective of citizens, citizens have gained enormously in the last 2 decades from some of the dominance that we've seen from these platforms. I would challenge anyone in this room, and there was a fabulous series that was published a short while ago by a journalist who tried to take herself off each of the platforms in turn for a week, and then in week 6 she took herself off all 5 big technology platforms, and to see how it affected her life. And it affected her life enormously in ways that she hadn't even imagined. I mean, in the 6th week, she literally couldn't function. It's almost like becoming a survivalist and going out into the wilds. But I think one of the reasons why I think we have to question and properly interrogate why digital dominance is a problem is because unless we identify what it is that's a problem with digital dominance, unless we can specifically say why if they are abusing their power, then we won't be able to figure out how to respond and how to deal with them. And again, that's one of the reasons, certainly one of the reasons why I think Damian put this book together and why we're working on another one, because I wanted to understand, not just in the area of journalism and news, but across the whole piece, the economic, the social, the political implications of platforms, and why they were potentially damaging society, why they were a problem for competition law, why they're a problem in elections, and they're undermining the legitimacy of our elections. And we start to do that. We can talk more about specific examples, but we start to do that. I mean, two of the writers in this book, Patrick Barwise and Leo Watkins, talk about, if you look at the economic sphere, how a platform like Amazon. Now, I don't know how many of you realize this, but actually Amazon was the platform that the journalist found it most difficult to remove herself from. Not because of the Amazon shop and the Amazon retail, but because the Amazon cloud, so much of the internet is now held on the Amazon cloud. And if you take yourself away from Amazon and you deliberately don't use those sites, you are literally unable to access much of the internet. But of course, one of the things that Barwise and Watkins point out in their chapter is that not only does this mean that Amazon has a remarkable amount of data and intelligence, it has data intelligence about its competition. It has data intelligence about very successful new organizations that are rising up, that are being successful, and it can, and according to some reports, has intervened to buy companies, to produce products which are competitive with these emerging products. And so there you see an instance where it's quite clear that size and that dominance allows Amazon to essentially abuse its power in terms of competition. If you take something like, Ben Wagner writes about the role that these platforms now play in terms of free speech and how the rules and guidelines of these platforms have built up over a number of years in a very, very ad hoc way. But that those rules and guidelines have come to be many of the rules and guidelines that define free speech online. And as he points out, many of them were made with a 13-year-old American teenager in mind. That was who they were thinking of when they brought in many of these guidelines originally, because that's who they wanted to protect against on Facebook. Or you take an example like Orla Linsky. Orla Linsky charts how, anyone who was at the Julia Angwin session earlier would have heard her talk about how the way in which these platforms fund themselves, particularly through advertising and especially through targeted advertising, leads to really significant dangers, and indeed some of these have been borne out, of discrimination. Indeed, actually, I go further and I say that actually targeted advertising, particularly the model that Facebook has built, relies on discrimination. Now, discrimination is a very loaded word. There are different types of discrimination that are neutral or even positive. But certainly in many of the cases that Julia Angwin cited and I've seen that Orla Linsky talks about, where people are able to target job ads, target particular opportunities to people based on their gender, on their ethnicity, on their age. It breaks laws, and certainly it breaks ethics in many countries. And finally, just to come back to news and journalism, which Natalie Hellberger looks at in the book, and she looks at how we're constantly talking about regulating content on the platforms and thinking about content, but actually we should be, that's incredibly complex and difficult area to start with for all the free speech reasons, for all the free press reasons that we've talked about over the last few days. But a much less, I suppose, explosive area to look at and to discuss, and in many ways easier to regulate but equally important, is the relationships that these platforms have with third parties and news providers. That actually having rules and regulations around non-discriminatory relationships, around having open terms, around having the ability to negotiate or fair contracts between the platforms and third parties, and particularly with news organizations, would go an enormously long way to solving some of the problems that we've discussed in the last few days. So as I say, I think we have to not necessarily kind of be like Peter Thiel and sort of talk endlessly about the benefits of dominance and the benefits of digital monopolies, but we have to at least acknowledge that these platforms have brought some huge benefits, particularly to consumers and citizens, and that if we're to figure out how best to challenge the dominance and challenge their power, then we first have to properly interrogate what the problems with it are and what the abuses of it are.
Thanks. So I just want to respond to that by offering some observations from my own work. When I was at the Tao Center in 2016, I was part of a project looking at the relationship between platforms and news publishers, and we talked with all kinds of different publishers about how they were responding to this new social distribution landscape. And, you know, I totally understand the roots of journalism's skepticism about the platforms, because there's all kinds of strategic and organizational and business model fallout from the dominance of platforms in distribution. But the interesting thing for me, having gone from the Tao Center now to Shorenstein and working with the non-commercial side of the news world, is that I really think that there's an interesting incentives misalignment problem that you get out of when you are in the reader revenue business as opposed to the advertising business. So I think it's become pretty clear in the last 18 months that if you're trying to compete for advertising dollars with the platforms, that's just a game that you're never going to win as a news publisher. But what I've seen in the non-commercial world is that for news organizations that are able to see the platforms as lead generation, finding new readers, and as tools for building relationships with those readers, that can actually align some of those misaligned incentives in a different kind of business model, and then you can start to think about what are the generative possibilities of using those tools to build an audience and engage with them. So I think it's really important to think about what are the kind of fundamental economics of these different news publisher models when we think about dominance and how to address it, because there's questions that I think we haven't been able to answer when we're like solely in a advertising-driven frame. Go ahead.
I mean, I think that's a good point, and we're slightly back at this old question of the kind of relationship between journalism and news and the platforms. But I guess the point I'm trying to get across is fundamentally the problem is one of power and the fact that there is an imbalance, and the platforms are able, in terms of things like revenue splits between platforms and publishers, in terms of ad revenue, the platforms are setting the price because of their position of dominance. Now, the Cairncross Review, which is a recent policy review in relation to journalism, proposed a way of dealing with that, which was a transparent code of conduct which would regulate the arrangements between them and set out principles of fairness in those relationships. But there's a different approach, of course, which is to say you deal with this structurally, and that the problem of dominance per se is the problem that you need to address, not the rules and the behavioral approach to it. So I'm suggesting that we might want to develop a little bit more long-term vision about where we go and the what if these behavioral rules fail. So what if we're still, because of that power imbalance, dealing with those disputes about the platform-publisher relationship in 3, 4, 5 years' time? What's the next stage? And the next stage, obviously, is some sort of structural remedy, which means breaking up or structural separation.
Yeah, I think the interesting question for me when you talk about long-term structural change, so if you think about, the internet as a stack, right, and we talked a little bit about that at the beginning, like at what levels of that stack, infrastructure, protocol, application content, at what layers of the stack do we think we would need new institutions or new technology? Because I think the other question is like, okay, is what we've built here just, not savable? And really, when we think about structural change, we're going to have to think about a totally different set of technologies that can kind of build on a new set of values, given what we've learned. And then, the internet as we know it will, I don't know, crash and burn or only be for a certain segment of society. I mean, I think they're really interesting combined technical and institutional questions.
They are, and I think one of the things that we're going to come to, I think, when we open the discussion up to people out there is the inevitable question, which is what do we do about it, and how do we use, what tools do we use to deal with dominance and with these companies? And I think to come back to what Damian was saying about where we're going to go, I think the problem that we have at the moment is that we reach for tools that we have already available. Of course we do. That's in our nature, and that's what we have. And the problem is not only that those tools are in many ways insufficient, but actually that those tools potentially could make things worse. And I'll talk just briefly about, for anyone who has been following some of the discussions around antitrust and competition. So Elizabeth Warren was one of the few Democrat candidates to come out and very explicitly say she wanted to break up the tech giants. And to lay out some specific policy proposals as to how she was going to do that. And my own view is that those actually are some of the most thoughtful proposals that I have heard in terms of that they actually do reflect thinking about how these platforms work and how to break them apart in such a way that could open them up for competition. But at the same time, there are two particular aspects she doesn't touch at all, one of which is the whole personal data aspect and how personal data has changed the terms of debate when you come to competition. So the extent to which someone like Google, to take one example, Google is, I don't know who has the app Waze. Waze is a fantastically useful sat-nav app which allows you not only to decide which way to go to work or wherever else, but tells you the traffic, and it does that because it has millions of people around the world who have downloaded the app and who use it all the time, and so it has real-time live traffic information. What it means in practice is that Google has huge amounts of real-time and historical data about people's movements, about traffic movements, about what sort of forms of transport people use, which it can feed into its development of automated vehicles, which it can feed into its development investments in Lyft and Uber, both of which it invests in, etc. So personal data is already and has been for many years used by these companies to move into different areas and to figure out how to use to their own advantage when it comes to competing with other players. But the second thing that the Warren proposals don't really seem to account for is something that, and this has been referred to a few times in this book, but Shoshana Zuboff's recent book, Surveillance Capitalism, where she points out that these companies, particularly Google and Facebook, but these companies' platforms, have developed a new economic model based upon constant and intrusive data surveillance. and that if all we do is seek to break apart these companies, then what we will almost certainly see is the emergence of either new companies or offshoots of these companies, which could potentially grow to as, if not greater scale, on the same model. And if the problem is with the data surveillance model, surveillance capitalism model, then simply using existing competition and antitrust law to break these companies up is not going to solve that. In fact, it will just extend the problem and spin it out into other different features.
Have you seen in your research any good ideas for how to solve that problem of personal data portability? Is that part of what you're working on in the next version?
So one of the things that we are trying to think about, and perhaps we can discuss, is I've come to the conclusion, certainly, that we need to think a lot more radically than we have in the past, that we need to be much, much more open to really genuinely new ideas about how we not just deal with these companies, but deal with the digital environment. And there are some people who are, I'm frustrated by the lack of political discussion around this, but there are some people who are proposing radical ideas, whether it's around the socialization of data and the degree to which we should have social pools of data, both potentially in both the public and the commercial sphere. The degree to which we need to transform some of the ways of democratic engagement using some of these digital tools such that we have not necessarily direct democracy, but we have much, much more digitally enabled democracy. Damian might want to talk more about some of the people we've been speaking to, but things like, and this is not me endorsing this, but things like nationalized search engines, things like how public service broadcasters who previously have really just been focused on content production, how they can be better threaded throughout our digital lives, because many of them are becoming increasingly marginal to our digital lives or themselves dependent upon these digital platforms. So is there, for example, any models for a sort of public social media platform? So I think we need to think a lot more broadly and radically than we have in the past about the types of responses and types of interventions we make, and not simply reach for some of the same tools that we had before.
Yeah, I think that's, to me, that is the most fascinating area for new thinking. A lot of my work has focused on public radio broadcasting in the U.S., and in going back and trying to understand the origins of the Public Broadcasting Act, part of how it came into being was an understanding that there was market failure in broadcasting for certain kinds of content. And so I think a really set of interesting questions to be thinking about now is, what is market failure in our current communication system? What is the market not providing us that we need? What is the market not providing us that democracy needs? And then what are those infrastructure type investments that we should be making and financing publicly so we have a different information ecosystem?
Yeah, there's a big difference between the way an economist thinks about market failure and the way a human thinks about market failure. I'm not an economist, but identifying narrow market failure areas because of public good characteristics or information problems or monopolies is one way. You're suggesting something different, is that society has a debate with itself about the kind of system it wants to live. What is a sufficient level of information provision for all citizens, for example? But I think we do need to think big, and we need to think long term. We need to think historically as well. If we think back to the 1920s, why we ended up with a BBC wasn't a debate about how an economist would view market failures in broadcasting. It was a debate about too much commercialism, too much advertising, and too much noise. In terms of interference on the spectrum. Yeah. But we have different noise problems now. Totally. And I think the reason that public service broadcasting institutions like the BBC and others have endured is because of their constitutional position. They are neither of the market or of the state. Yeah. They are independent, and they have independent forms of accountability to citizens and users, which are not mediated merely by the market and merely by individual consumption choices. So we need to think about institutions that are independent from the state, which are not necessarily commercial institutions built on the surveillance capitalism behavioral surplus business model, but do provide those communication goods and noise reduction that we need.
Absolutely. You know, it's really interesting. I draw a distinction in my work between, I'm an organizational sociologist by training, between organizations and institutions being the set of values and work on behalf of society that we think we need, and organizations being particular configurations of people and technology and ways to accomplish things. And I think one of the really interesting confoundings that we have in the current debate around saving journalism is this kind of confusion between the organizations that we have currently set up with certain business models to provide journalism and the institutional needs that we have currently, given the state of our politics and our economics and our society. So that's, I think, the debate that we need, and to be able to distinguish between, some organizations can fail. We're having tons of failing newspapers in the US, and maybe that's okay given the set of information needs that we have currently and what we want to design for.
Should we open up for questions? Oh, there's one over here and there's one over there. Do we need a mic?
Hi, I'm Alexander Fanta. I'm a journalist with Netzpolitik.org. We had a panel yesterday. We talked about how Google and Facebook are influencing journalism through their patronage. And I was hoping I could get your view on the question of how much kind of the media ecosphere becomes an accomplice to these companies when it takes their money and has these lopsided business relationships with them.
Complicated question.
I agree. I hate to get all Oedipal or Freudian on you, but I think there does seem to be this really peculiar sort of almost contradictory response at the moment to Google and Facebook amongst news organizations, where on the one hand there is in some ways very justified critique, sometimes slightly hysterical critique of these companies. On the other hand, there is a recognition that they are becoming increasingly dependent upon them. I mean, I don't know in this room, but certainly from many of those I've spoken to from news organizations, there are now not that many news organizations who don't have some sort of not only a collaboration and relationship in terms of content sharing, but actually a mutually financially beneficial relationship between the platforms in themselves. And that, I think, creates real issues. The slide's not up here right now, but normally the slide behind the people on this panel will say the two main sponsors of this conference are Google and Facebook, which, yes, gives you kind of a particular idea as to how contradictory this very session is.
I mean, I think I have maybe a counter argument to that. So, having studied and worked with newsrooms where resources are a real constraint, particularly around technology and tool development, it's just really expensive and may not actually make sense for a lot of these small news organizations to build their own technical infrastructure. And when you have, at scale global platforms like Google who have infinite resources, I'm not sure that it doesn't make sense for them to do some level of technology development for the ecosystem because it is so expensive and I think a waste of resources to have news organizations building their own tech stacks, not all of which talk to each other and not all of which work terribly well. So that would be my counter argument on the power dimension.
Tech investment and the rules around it is one thing. What I would call crumbs from the platform of funding on a case-by-case basis creates all sorts of problems in terms of very long-established issues of independence, of journalistic institutions and organizations. And I would say, tax them. There are a number of proposals on the table in different European countries. Every policy debate I get involved with at the moment comes with one proposal at the end, which is a levy on platforms to fund X or Y or Z. But rather than news companies going to, on a case-by-case basis, have their independence compromised, there should be mechanisms whereby there are more effective tax arrangements for these platforms, and that can be hypothecated to pay for certain public goods. We've done it before. It's not a huge problem. It doesn't necessarily have to be subject to problems of state capture or state influence on media.
So, my name is Andrea Latino. I'm an Italian entrepreneur and I work in the digital sector. So, I'm also, I would like to call myself a concerned citizen, I would say, especially because I work in that sector. So, I've seen the power of targeting ads and their influence on, I would say, normal people, the way that they can actually influence people into buying stuff they actually don't need, which is kind of the power of advertising in everywhere. But what I would like to argue about is that the problem in journalism is probably deeply related, of course, with business models, but also the incapability of building those IT stacks, those technology stacks that would actually help them to develop new business models in some ways. I'm thinking about American platforms such as Quartz and English platforms such as the Financial Times. They've tried to build their own capabilities, or The Verge in the, of course, the technology space. What I would like to know from you is, since many of those news organizations, which are not the ones that I actually cited right now, seems to be incapable of trying to build this kind of thing, and they've been up to it for like 15, 20 years, and they can't do it. Experiments like Apple News Plus, which has been, bashed by journalists themselves. Of course, Apple wasn't completely transparent on what you actually can access to in terms of the completeness of the publication themselves with their all-you-can-eat access, I would call it. So, how do you see this kind of attempt by a company that probably is the only one who actually has a stake and interest and a moral position in terms of respecting the user's privacy?
Well, I mean, I think, again, back to what's your business model as a publisher, I think there's different ways of answering that question. So if as a publisher, you're going to use Apple News to generate new readers, and they might hit your paywall, or they might be in Apple News and see subscribe to our newsletter, then you could think of that as lead generation. You could also think of it as a totally competitive offering, in which case, it's awful. So I think it really depends on the starting point for each of these news organizations. And I guess what I've seen is that there's oftentimes not a lot of strategic acumen amongst news organizations about their business model, what's their value proposition, where are they finding users, how are they building relationship, how are they converting them. So I would say, in the context of strategic confusion, yes, it can all suck, but it doesn't have to.
And something we talked about earlier, which is this, I think, a really important thing that you said, which is that news organizations have seen their future, most news organizations, as supported by advertising. And I think the extent to which news organizations will be supported by digital advertising is already, I think, shown to be very tenuous, and I think it will get even more so. So I think news organizations, once they recognize that their future is not in being funded through digital advertising, that actually changes lots of the dynamics of these discussions. But there is an additional problem, which you kind of talked about, which is that more and more, as the pressure increases on these platforms to make their services more hygienic and to focus on quality news, that they will make investments and they will make choices which are essentially editorial choices, and where they are, if not producing news themselves, then certainly deciding very carefully and strategically who they partner with. And again, that's going to be a significant problem for those news organizations that want to remain independent or that just simply don't get chosen by the platforms. So I think, as we've seen over the last 10 years, and I think we'll see over the next 10, the whole idea that these platforms are going to be friends to news organizations is a pretty dangerous one. Question just in front there.
Hi, I'm thinking like a sort of a more pluralistic approach. So, having a lot of people using a lot more, varied social media platforms could be very beneficial to sort of closed societies where we're seeing that governments are censoring platforms that have a lot of users. Looking alone at the example of Telegram in Iran, which had a lot of users and was then censored last year. At the same time, I do wonder how we would get to that point that we get people to use more varied platforms. And especially I work for public broadcaster, Germany's public broadcaster, Deutsche Welle. And we already have problems getting people to use, I guess we make a lot of have a lot of our traffic happening on social media, right? And so I really wonder how we would get to that stage where people would really be using like a public service broadcaster platform. So those 2 points, perhaps you guys have some ideas how we could get that transformation happening.
Can I just, as a show of hands, out of interest in this room, has anyone in this room used Mastodon? Or even heard of Mastodon, actually, but used Mastodon? 1, 2, okay, 3.
Okay.
Anyone who in this room has heard of Solid, the new Tim Berners-Lee one? I think there's a pretty good illustration for you as to these are attempts to try to take people. Mastodon's an attempt to try and shift people away from commercial social media to present an alternative to Twitter and to a certain extent to Facebook, but more to Twitter. And Solid is Tim Berners-Lee's attempt to try and shift away from the centralized commercial web to a more decentralized, non-commercial, or maybe not non-commercial, but a more decentralized one. But I think the problem inertia is enormous, and I think that anyone who seeks to create a parallel universe, essentially, is going to struggle unless there is active intervention, unless there is positive intervention to try and encourage people to shift. And that's where I suppose I'd come to the second point about public broadcasting and the role of public broadcasting. It seems to me as though there are certainly things that one could do in terms of intervention which would, from my perspective, be incredibly helpful to creating a more plural public space. To take one example, I mean, if I want to talk to my people in my geographic area who are in my ward, as it's called in the UK, or even in my constituency, which is my political representation, I either have to go manually door to door and have a conversation with them, or seek them out, which would take huge amounts of time on the social media platforms themselves. Now, why isn't there some sort of correlation between the civic public sphere and the virtual public sphere, where people speak in real voices in such a way that they are addressing actual political representatives, so that those representatives know that they ought to listen, whereas at the moment they can ignore the white noise of Twitter, etc. So I think there are examples of where we can much more intelligently link the civic realm and the political realm with the digital one in a kind of progressive way, which we haven't done yet.
Did you have an answer?
I think this question of how realistic is it to get to a new utopia of how realistic is it to get to a new utopia of multiple, plural, different types of social media platforms? It's very attractive, but is it really possible? I think you have to speak to a couple of things that we speak about in the book a little bit, or our authors do, which is network effects and data portability. So network effects is about the value of a network which increases with every node on that network, obviously, and that creates quite self-fueling competition effects whereby you lock in early movers and there's a strong first mover advantage. So Facebook is in such a powerful position because it's difficult for us to move away from Facebook to one of these new platforms, not only because of data portability, but because all our friends are there, not anywhere else. So these network effects really create this situation of dominance, and that's another reason why normal competitive pressures won't dislodge them. Data portability is really interesting. Many of you will have noticed that Zuckerberg's latest pitch for regulation, that's point 4. He says we need to work on data portability. Data portability, of course, is already there in the GDPR. There are new rights. They haven't been fully tested legally. We need to think very carefully about how they're implemented in Europe and whether they actually can be used in order to create real ability to shift. But I think we will require new forms of regulation to actually unlock those problems of network effects. And it's data portability, and maybe that's why Zuckerberg is happy to endorse it. Data portability alone is not going to resolve this problem and introduce real competition. Public service broadcasting in Europe is extremely important, isn't it, in this, because we still have these mixed systems and we still have these major players. And that enables citizens and parliaments to articulate some principles that could be implemented. So whether it's the German Interstate Broadcasting Treaty or the BBC Charter can be changed. And one area where I think it's been fascinating to see, particularly what the BBC has done, is they've shifted to a data-driven model to a certain extent. You know, so to use BBC services, you have to give up quite a lot of personal data, and you're being tracked and monitored, and services are being personalized. I don't remember a big public debate about that, and I think that's something we're going to have to continue to work on. But it is that we still have the power in those public service broadcasters to bring people to content, to bring people to services. But there's no real strategy for where we should be in 5, 10 years' time.
And that conversation is happening in U.S. public broadcasting too, thinking about, you know, what's the infrastructure for identity management? Should we just be replicating, you know, the best or worst practices of commercial media? But I think the advantage that public broadcasters have, at least in the US, where there's a highly decentralized system, is that you have institutions in communities that can convene people in spaces that aren't digital. And, you know, some institutions do a good job of that, and some are, you know, finding their way to it. But to me, that's where a lot of power can be exercised in terms of building communities and starting to, like, you know, have a different kind of conversation in the face-to-face.
Actually, that's a really interesting point about the degree to which we should have public discussions around this, particularly for public service broadcasters, because, I mean, I know that internally the BBC had a big debate about the degree to which they should track and the degree to which people should have to log in so that you could have personalization. And the problem that they had internally, because a lot of people were very against the idea and felt that this is not the role of a public broadcaster to do this, but the problem that they had was whenever they went out and did focus group research, etc., that they would talk to people who on the theoretical side said, yeah, there's a real problem with that. I can see the problem with that. But when it came to actually comparing services, they just said, yeah, but Netflix gives me what I want.
Right.
And they would talk about how just Netflix and Amazon were better because you know, I get to my stuff quicker. And so there's this big disconnect, I think, still between people, on the one hand, recognizing that they shouldn't perhaps give up all this personal data, and on the other hand, actually, yeah, but it really does give me all these benefits. And for public broadcasters and for public service bodies, I think that presents a real dilemma as to how they respond and how they protect privacy whilst at the same time making services more personal and tailored. Any other questions?
Any other questions? In the back?
Hi, my name is Lucy. I'm from The Economist. I know we don't have much time. I have 2 questions, so maybe you can choose which one you would prefer to answer. The first is, are there any moments in history that we can draw on that could provide lessons for how to think about what's going on right now? Just a small question. And the second one is, I'm based in the States, and if I think about how Congress handled Mark Zuckerberg last year, I really worry about who is doing the regulating and how much they know and understand about this kind of stuff. So in your mind, who should be doing the regulating in a perfect situation?
Okay, I'll take the first one. I think we were in this room yesterday and your colleague was explaining why The Economist in particular is so good at doing these historical perspectives. The moment I would choose is the post-war period, immediately post-war, where there was a huge debate in the US, in the UK, and also in Germany about the power of large media organizations, their responsibilities, and the fundamental deal around liberty, press freedom in this case, and responsibility. So in the US, the Hutchins Commission was a really fascinating moment whereby, if you like, a new deal or a new settlement was hammered out, whereby broadcasters were expected to be fair, given their concentrated power and opinion formation, and the press were subject to competition laws which prevented them being too big, and we had the emergence over the subsequent years of the diversity arrangements in US media. Very similar with the Royal Commission on the Press in the UK, and the setting up post-war of the German broadcasting systems, and eventually the emergence of a similar framework around European pluralism, which then became the Council of Europe's, very influential in the Council of Europe's eventual approach to freedom of expression and pluralism as fundamental principles. So it's that post-war period, looking back at problems of dictatorship and propaganda and the failure of democracy in a moment of political opportunity. And we're in a similar period now, I would argue, for setting up a new settlement, a very long-term settlement, which is about the role of gatekeepers like the big tech platforms in relation to democratic communication.
I think we're going to have to wind up in a second, but I'm going to try and do 1 and 2 if I can, with a different historical precedent. I'm going to choose 1890, where Senator John Sherman took on the might of the